to be Davos and time for the Edelman Trust Barometer, now in its 13th year, bigger, better every year. In a moment, I'll ask our CEO and President Richard Edelman to take us through a brief summary of some of the findings this year. We're also joined by this excellent panel that you see before you, and I'll introduce them to you in a moment. You may have read in the FT and also The Economist last week two rather splendid obituaries for the founder of this company, Daniel J. Edelman, who founded the company 60 years ago in Chicago with a couple of associates and a couple of telephones. And 60 years later, there's 4,500 Edelman people. You'll probably all work for Edelman one day. You don't realise this yet, but 60 cities around the world. It's you've come a long way. And Richard, we're very, even in these sad days, we're very happy to have you here. As you told us, Dan would have expected things to carry on, and that's what you're doing. So thank you for being here. Our panel, next to me, Tom Galbraith, Lord Strathclyde, until very recently leader of the Conservative Party in the House of Lords, a job you held down for 13 years. A long time, long enough. But he sits before us today, liberated, having left the cabinet and the role in the Lords, and free to tell us all about the joys of coalition government, the joys of working with Liberal Democrats, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thanks very much for being here. Sarah Churchwell, Professor Sarah Churchwell. Let me get the job title right because it's so magnificent. It's very important to get the title right. She's a professor of American literature and the public understanding of the humanities. Quite a big job at the University of East Anglia. But you'll recognise Sarah from the Late Review on Fridays after Newsnight. If you're watching ITV News on the election night, the US presidential election, Sarah kept going miraculously hours and hours and seemed to know just about every district of every state with Al Stewart. And even more importantly, has a book coming out this summer on the Great Gatsby. It's called Careless People. It's all about the genesis, the writing of, the production of that great book, which will be a favourite of many people in the room, I know, and really a blow-by-blow account of how it came to be written in 1922. Set in 1922. Tim Montgomery is a phenomenon. He's a remarkable guy. He's the force behind Conservative Home, which I'm sure people here drop into many times a day. It's an extraordinary journalistic triumph and essential reading now in the political scene. Tim is also a regular on TV and radio shows and panels. And in spite of that, he also finds time to play the part of Casper in the popular Danish political drama Borgen. That last bit isn't strictly true. You're much better looking than that actor. But keep the beard going. And Robert Shrimsley, who is the manager of FT.com, which, as we know, is the future of the FT, and previously chief political correspondent both for the FT and for the Daily Telegraph, and a scion of that great journalistic Shrimsley dynasty as well. And we're delighted to have you here, Robert. Richard, can I ask you to say a few words about the 2013 Edelman Trust Barometer?
Thank you, and thanks very much for those words about my dad. So this year, the Trust Barometer was done in 26 countries. We looked at two different groups. The informed elites, these are people sort of the top 25% of population in terms of income, college plus educated, 3 or 4 media a day, the sort of media attentives. We also did a 1,000-person survey in each of the countries of general population. And we started that Gen Pop 2 years ago because we never wanted to be classified as simply the PR firm of the elites. So here are a couple of the important findings. The first is, generally speaking, trust rose last year across the 26 nations. We now see an equal number of countries in the truster, neutral, and distruster category, it looks more like 2013 than 2012. The interesting phenomenon is that the distrusters actually include some surprising names. Japan and Korea, as an example, are at the bottom of the list, along with traditionals, meaning people who've been there forever, like Russia, which is always the least trusting country in the world. At the highest end, no surprise, China, India, Indonesia, 2/3 of the truster countries are from Asia. The major movers in the last couple of years have been the United States up, Germany up, Canada up. Those are the big movers. The two important statistics, though. One is that the general population is about 10 points lower in trust than the elites. Our theory on this is that, frankly, the general population isn't doing as well as the elites. And so there's lower trust across every one of the institutions for general population. There's the biggest gap in the United States, from 59 to 45. In other words, 59 is the elites, 45 is the mass. Also, the fragility of trust. I want to underline this. The so-called top two box, this is a research term, the people who on a scale of 1 to 10 say that their trust in business, for instance, is an 8 or a 9. They're in the top two box. Those who have a weaker view of trust but are trusters are in 6 or 7. About 2/3 to 3/4 of those who say they're positive towards business or government are in the 6 or 7. They're not in the top two box. So their affinity for any institution is relatively weak. The reason that this matters is that we've just gone back into the field in the US and the UK after the US election and just around the time of the budget morass. The trust in government fell almost 10 points. Number two, trust in media in the UK declined from 44 to 30. 44 to 30, making media the least trusted institution in the UK in the wake of the Leveson report. So the fragility is evident in what I've just told you. Now, let's go through each of the institutions quickly. NGOs remain the most trusted institution in the world. The key change is actually in Asia, where NGO trust is spiking. NGO trust in China is equal to that of government at 81 points versus 5 years ago when it was at 48. Why? Localization and need. People are mad about the environment. As for media, generally, media trust scores are up around the world. The reason is actually the dimensionalization of media. The rise of social, the rise of blogs, like yours, and also giving credit to media for having been early and prescient about scandals. And so media is generally up. But the idea that everyone is focused on mainstream, not true. Particularly young go first to search, not to individual media. Government. Government remains the least trusted institution around the world. In about 3/4 of the markets, government is under 50% trust. It is still a crisis for government in terms of trust. And the reason is that government is seen as, in some cases, corrupt, in other cases, incompetent, but that is a fatal combination. That it's neither good nor good at it, if I could put it that way. Business. Trust in business actually is in the ascendant. Trust in business is actually at its highest level since 2007. The gap between business and government trust is again at the highest level since 2007. There are some of the markets where there's a 40-point gap between trust in business and trust in government. Those would be Mexico, Brazil, Argentina. Again, some of this is bad performance by government, actually. But even in places like India, Japan, you have 20-point gaps between business and government trust. And these are very significant because kind of business is on its own. The idea that government is going to be an effective change creator is just not viable at the moment. Now, moving from the state of trust, let's go into the financial services industry because I think here we actually see a very important set of data. Banks actually hit bottom in the US in 2011 and in the UK, France, and Germany in 2012. However, we are still 20 points below the peaks of 2008. Banks actually have two different sets of problems, and we asked specifically about performance. In the developed countries, basically banks get a failing grade for lending to small business, credit card availability, also IPOs and debt trading. In the developing markets, banks are the heroes. So again, in China, India, et cetera, banks are fine. Also, banks are just fine in markets like Japan and Canada, where there have been no banking scandals. But banks have another problem, and this probably is more core to this year's story. Almost 60% of the respondents said that they believe that it's the bonus culture, corporate corruption that have led to the problems of banks. And that's at the soul. That's not like Shell, that's at the soul of banking. And also, 63% of people said that they believe that the scandals evident in financial services now are spreading to other industries. So the stain, if you think about a bottle of ink, is now spreading to the rest of business from the banking sector. I also briefly want to touch on two other aspects of reputation. One is that there is a serious national identity, corporate headquarter national identity aspect to trust. So if you're a company that is based in China, trying to operate in the UK or the US, you have a serious reputation anchor around your ankles. In other words, a Chinese company in the UK is trusted by only 15%, whereas a German, a French, a Spanish, whatever, going into developing or developed markets, you're equivalent. You're sort of around 70, 80% trust. So a developing headquartered company is fine in the developing markets but has problems in the developed markets. Also, there's an important aspect of sector trust. In other words, tech continues to be in the ascendant. Technology, despite issues of privacy or other things, is untouched. It's still in the high 70s, actually followed by automotive. Automotive is the phoenix. It's 5 years ago was in the bottom 3. Today, it's second in almost every market in the world. It's a remarkable success story. Contrast that to banks and financial services, which are 9th and 10th. Now, let's get to the central part of the story for this year, which is the crisis of leadership. We observe an increasing divide between the ascendant trust of institutions and the flatlined to declining trust of leaders. And we observe this on the basis that basically people don't believe leaders tell them the truth. We asked the question directly last year, and we confirm it this year. We asked specifically, do you believe that a leader will tell you the truth in a difficult or complex situation? A business leader, only 18% say, yes, I do. And a government leader, 13%. And there are some markets that are even more catastrophic, like Germany, 6%. The gap in China, which is traditionally a very high trust market, 71% believe and trust in government, and only 27% believe that a government leader will tell them the truth. Now, there's an impact of Beaujolais. That is a direct impact of what has happened in the last year in terms of corruption. And there are 3 or 4 other stories out of China about government official questionable behavior. So our thesis on this is that, in fact, we now see, I was talking before with somebody who said, I trusted such and such company because of the CEO. Well, our theory is that it's exactly the opposite now. Actually, today, CEOs and government officials rank 9th and 10th in terms of credible spokespeople. The highest is an expert, an academic, all you professors, Sarah, that's you, charge higher rates. But the other is a person like yourself, a peer, or an employee, who are twice as credible as a chief executive or a government leader as a spokesperson. And so, if you're just putting your CEO out or your government prime minister or whatever, you're not being very astute. Last section, I think, of all the things I want you to go home and think about, it used to be that reputation was premised on performance. So if you made the numbers, if you had a top flight CEO, if you ranked high in your category among media companies, the Viacom ranked higher than CBS or something, then you had done it. That was 70-something% level. Today, after the problems of 2008, what we observe is, in fact, that's the lowest aspect of building trust. That is simply table stakes. Operations is table stakes. And that's what companies spend all their time doing. So what really matters? Treating your employees well, having a transparent operation, having ethical behavior, putting your customers ahead of profits. These are things that are trust builders. So our thesis going forward in this time is that, in fact, we believe that CEOs, prime ministers, others, have to lead differently. We believe in this notion of inclusive leadership, that it cannot be a one-man team. You have to play with team members. Tell your employees what's going on. Tell your customers, talk to them. That, in fact, the classic pyramid of influence, which many of you probably studied in government class as I did, now has a sister or a brother, which is the inverted pyramid of community. And that in that pyramid of community, people are actually communicating horizontally. And these are peers, these are employees, these are social activists. So that part at the top is still vertical. That part is still top-down and controlled in the message and all that. But it's the part at the bottom that really is the new normal. And that's really where change will happen. So with that, Stefan, I'll be glad to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Richard. So you say that peers are important. This brings me to my... Thank you. Tom, do politicians who are in the thick of it, to quote the TV show, do they despair privately of getting a fair hearing from the public? We've heard these trust figures. Is the game up, or is there something politicians can do as a breed to get that trust score higher?
Yes, definitely. There is something that politicians can do. And no, I don't think that any politician ever despairs that they are unable to get their message across or that they cannot be trusted. On the way here, I was sort of wondering exactly how to pitch this. And do you remember some time ago people used to talk about one of the great fibs is the checks in the post? Well, increasingly with modern technology and electronic banking, that little saying has got a shelf life. But try this one. Trust me. I'm from the government. I'm here to help. Now, very few people actually believe that that is what is going to happen when a politician says this, and yet politicians who say it believe it in their souls, that they are trying to do their best, and they are motivated by the very highest instincts. Now, what's come out of this survey today, which I'm going to grab, is an upward trend, just a minute shift in that people trusting politicians a little bit more. Actually, as a conservative, I also think that it's a healthy thing that there is some skepticism about what government can achieve. Because inevitably, governments overpromise, provide huge expectations, and then find it very difficult to deliver. And that is part of the problem that I think trust has. So I think this survey is extremely useful, not just for this year, but because you, Edelmans, have been doing it for so long, and so that you can see the trends over time. Now, of course, trust is a fundamental building block of human happiness. It is the glue that binds us all. I can't think of a single relationship, a personal relationship, a business relationship, which isn't built on trust and requires trust for it to grow. And that's not just between businesses, but within businesses. This community aspect, horizontal communication that occurs at every level of our lives. Now, in politics today, for the last 2.5 years, I hope you don't mind me banging on like this.
No, you're doing
do tell me to shut up. But over the last 2.5 years, we've been having our own experiment in the United Kingdom of trust in coalition. This is a group of people who never believed in their wildest dreams that they would end up working together as closely together as we currently do. And yet, over a few days in May, not quite making the same comparison as 1940, but two political parties got together in coalition for the national interest to try and get things right, particularly in terms of public finances. And that relationship is still as strong, and I believe will endure, albeit over the course of the last 2.5 years and in the next 2.5 years, there will be some very difficult bumps that we will have to get through. But part of that has been an experiment in trust and working together. And actually, many people, many of you who interact with government, I think you will have been surprised at just how well ministers do work together. Why is this? Because I think that fundamentally, people perhaps outside the informed elites that Richard Edelman talked about, they like the idea of politicians working together, trying to solve mutual problems. At the next election, we will see whether they like the reality of that. But what should politicians do? I think in order to earn trust, you have to trust yourself. So politicians need to trust people more, listen to more of what is being said, and provide leadership. We need to sloganize less. And most of all, as a parliamentarian for the last quarter of a century, I think we need to legislate less, make fewer new laws, decomplex legislation so that more people understand it, and we stop making criminals out of people who are doing nothing wrong, and reduce the overwhelming torrent of legislation that comes out of Parliament. I'll make one final point, if I may. In all the time that I've been involved in politics, and many of you have been involved in it too, the levels of corruption in British politics are extremely low. Most parliamentarians are motivated by this desire to improve people's lives. We don't have to agree with all their methods or indeed all their ideas, but we should, I think, be optimistic about the roles that politicians play in Parliament and the essential motivation to make things better for the people of this country.
Thank you. So a positive start. Thank you. Sarah, the general picture from the data is of a society that it has low levels of trust in all sorts of institutions and businesses, and seems to have quite low expectations even of leaders and organisations. Is this being reflected in our cultural life? Is there any way out of it? How do you think artists, by and large, are responding to this era of cynicism, if we can call it that?
It's actually an interesting question. I'll have to think more about how art might be responding to it. Generally, art takes a little bit longer, I think, to respond to these kinds of trends, although film is certainly starting to respond to it, and very quickly. But I was thinking more about your middle question about what's to be done. I probably, unusually for an academic, trying to be pragmatic about it and say, okay, can we actually do anything about this? And it seems to me that there are a couple of ways in which we might frame the issue and think about this. I was struck in the Trust Barometer by the rise of trust in individuals. And that's been interpreted broadly in terms of social media. But also it struck me that when we talk about institutions, it's something that I've been noticing since at least 2008. People kept talking about what banks did and saying, oh, well, the market did this. Well, it wasn't the market that did it. It was individuals that did it. And talking about the market became a way of evading responsibility. It became a way of evading accountability and said, well, there's this thing out there, this force, and it had a will of its own, and it went off and did that, and it had no conscience, and it had no morals. And it seemed to me that many of us are seeking a return to accountability. One of the reasons why we have no trust in our leaders, why I can tell you I have very little trust in almost all leaders, is because I have a sense that they have almost no skin in the game. That some of them have no skin in the game at all, and there's no accountability because they can't be punished either. So they're neither incentivized to do well nor punished if they do badly. That seems to me a very dangerous situation that we've gotten ourselves into. But it also seems to me when we think about we hear a lot about accountability, and I hear less about responsibility. And it seems to me that responsibility adds a different nuance into the conversation. Because again, accountability implies a kind of external force of authority that will come out and punish you if you do wrong, and you will be held to account. Whereas responsibility returns to that notion of the individual. And actually says, and not for us to suddenly say, well, it's our fault. I don't mean it that way at all, except that in a sense, it is, because as a society, we have condoned various kinds of shifts in our value system, and I think we're reaping the consequences of those. One, for example, is the notion that we're all consumers. I think we would do much better to start thinking about ourselves again as citizens rather than as consumers, and with all that implies. and that would help us think in terms of our ethical relationship to other people and to the world, and again, returning us to a sense of responsibility. But also when we talk about not trusting the media, say in the wake of the Leveson scandal, it was also individual journalists who broke the Leveson story. It was individual journalists who broke, you'll forgive me, the MP's expenses scandal. So there are individuals out there who are doing the right thing, and the institutions seem to be broken, corrupt, stagnating, not working the way that we'd like them to. The other thing, though, that I was thinking about is, and that I always think about, and in response to what you were saying about the work I've been doing on The Great Gatsby, is how little we seem to learn. It's extraordinary how we have to keep learning the same lessons over and over and over again. Each generation seems to need to learn them for themselves. And I was thinking, particularly in the wake of, some of you will have noticed that I'm not from these parts. And in the wake of what was a momentous day in my country yesterday with the re-inauguration of President Obama, and people were talking about the second inaugural speech and what can we look for from it and what might he say. And the comparisons, actually Jonathan Friedland brought this up as well. It was a little bit eerie because I'd been thinking along the same lines. I wrote about this in The Guardian over the weekend. He made a very quick comparison to the great two second inaugural speeches in American history, which would be Lincoln's and FDR's. And I started thinking about FDR. FDR is one of the most trusted presidents in American history. We don't quite have the statistics to back it up because they didn't do anything like your wonderful demographic research. But we know broadly that he was incredibly trusted. And yet, in the 1920s, in the era of The Great Gatsby and Scott Fitzgerald, the era of the boom, was an era of intense political corruption in America. The Teapot Dome scandal in 1923, which most people have forgotten about today, makes Russia look trustworthy, frankly. I mean, it was so corrupt. They had cabinet ministers were leasing state-owned oil fields in return for interest-free loans. Right? So they were simply selling state-owned oil fields. And by the way, some of that, the consequence of some of that, we still live with. The Teapot Dome scandal was in 1923. When FDR was re-inaugurated in 1937, he was one of the most trusted politicians in American history. What happened? How could they go from? So the thing is, I think that when we look at the past and we say, oh, well, we used to trust in government in the 1950s, in the 1930s, people trusted in government, now they don't. Well, it wasn't that they were naive then. And that's my point about the Teapot Dome scandal. They'd lived through corruption. They understood it. They didn't start out trusting government. FDR made them trust him because, guess what, he was trustworthy. And he demonstrated that over the period of bringing the nation out of the Depression. So I thought if you'd bear with me, I would read just a couple of lines from his second inaugural speech, because they seem to be so apropos in a really spooky way, and yet it's the lesson that we keep not learning. So he was speaking on January 20th, 1937. Those of you who are better at math than I am will be able to tell us how many years ago that was. Yes. I'm okay with words, but I'm really, really bad with numbers. So here's this is a speech that's often cited because it has the famous line, I see 1/3 of a nation ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-nourished. That's the soundbite from this speech. But there's another part of the speech that gets a little bit less rehearsal, and I thought I'd just read a couple lines out and then I'll stop. We have always known that heedless self-interest was bad morals. We know now that it is bad economics. Out of the collapse of a prosperity whose builders boasted their practicality has come the conviction that in the long run, economic morality pays. We are beginning to wipe out the line that divides the practical from the ideal, and in so doing, we are fashioning an instrument of unimagined power for the establishment of a morally better world. This new understanding undermines the old admiration of worldly success as such. We are beginning to abandon our tolerance of the abuse of power by those who betray for profit the elementary decencies of life. In this process, evil things formerly accepted will not be so easily condoned. Hard-headedness will not so easily excuse hard-heartedness. We are moving toward an era of good feeling, but we realize that there can be no era of good feeling save among men of goodwill. Thank you.
Thank you. And
I say thank you as if I was FDR. That's a good speech, isn't it? I hope you like my turn of phrase.
But he, and talking of responsibility of leaders, he also said that he faced great opposition. He faced, indeed, the hatred of certain vested interests. And he said, I welcome their hatred.
Absolutely. And of course, they still hate him. I mean, that's exactly what the GOP is still trying to do, is to roll back precisely the entitlements that FDR created in the New Deal. So we are still fighting that battle.
Tim, similar question to Tom, really. I mean, we don't see many leaders, perhaps not since Mrs. Thatcher, standing up and saying, effectively, I welcome the hatred of my opponent. Do you think politicians have lost have lost confidence in their ability to persuade audiences? I mean, do they also feel that there's so much cynicism out there that they just have to play for that little marginal advantage that the focus groups are leading them to? How does it feel to you?
Well, one thing, I don't think we should underestimate the self-belief of politicians. I don't know how most of the politicians think particularly of Gordon Brown in the last 3 years of the Labour government. What is thrown at politicians on a daily basis is extraordinary, and their ability to survive and still believe in themselves, their ability to turn situations around. I think most of them must have rhino hides to cope with what is thrown at them. So I think you have to have huge self-belief to be a politician. But I think you also have to be a sort of aware of what voters expect of you. One of the wisest things that I learned when I first sort of got involved in politics on a professional level with Ian Duncan Smith, sort of about 10 years ago, well before a lot of the expenses crisis that has dogged politicians, was, he said, voters, if they read that a politician has been caught in bed with a goat, are not surprised. He said they do not expect politicians to be ethical. Now, and I know we recently did an opinion poll when we asked voters what they knew had happened in the news. It was a completely open question, first of all. Can you name anything that has happened in politics in recent times? 40% of people couldn't mention a single thing. Those that could voluntarily mention anything could come up with scandals. The Andrew Mitchell business. They could mention George Osborne allegedly not paying for his first-class rail ticket. We then asked them a number of set questions and said, can you remember any of these things happening? And we named specific things, including the Osborne first-class thing and Andrew Mitchell. And those were way above anything to do with policy. And we actually made up some things. We had this Labour MP called Audrey Burns, I think she was, who'd misused union funds to wallpaper her home. 20% of people could remember that incident happening. We made up David Evans, the Tory MP who married Tory MP who slept with another man. Again, nearly 20% of people could remember that. And so you're starting with this huge problem right from the beginning, is that public are ill-disposed to believe that politicians are ethical. What they expect, and this is sort of the other half of Ian Duncan Smith's sort of message to me, was what they expect is you to deliver basic competence, to deliver basic goods, to honour most of the key election promises that you have made. And it's when politicians fail to do that that they struggle. And I think that at the root, particularly for a Conservative Party which sells itself as the party of the mind and the head, when you have a year like we had last year with the U-turns, with the sense that policy hadn't been thought through, that's particularly dangerous for a political party. We recently gathered some think tanks together with some businesses, and the whole purpose of the event was to discuss what the think tanks were working on in terms of policy, what the new things that they were planning, what the new subjects they were working on. And it was an extraordinary meeting because all of the businesses there, once the sort of policy presentations had ended, it all became a complete discussion of we're fed up of hearing new policy initiatives. We're fed up about hearing the new thinking. We just want things that you are already been scheming about and thinking about for a long time to actually deliver them. Where's the implementation of existing ideas, existing wonkery? And this huge business of Whitehall reform, the ability of government to actually deliver, is incredibly significant. And it's the hugely examined, understudied part of how we look at politics. Look at the number of think tanks that we have that are looking for new policy look at the thinness of the study on the machine. We had with Edelman recently, Conservative Home, in this room, we had 4 ex-ministers from 4 departments come in to talk about what they'd learned in government, what had worked, what hadn't. And each of them, interestingly, said this was the first time anyone had seriously asked them for their experiences. They hadn't had a debriefing from Whitehall. They hadn't been asked to share what they'd learned. They hadn't been, or even when they arrived, they hadn't been given, you're undertaking this new job, this is how you will succeed. And the casualness, the amateurishness with which we approach how we govern is, I think, part of the problem. So just to finish, Stefan, I would say sort of 2 things are incredibly important to begin to restore trust for politicians. One is absolute clarity of your purpose, so that voters know what you're going to do and they can somehow measure that. And that's been confused by the coalition to some extent. My mum's my greatest political advisor. She wants politicians to work together and come together, but she also wants them to keep their manifesto promises. Well, when that happens, you can't do both easily. But, making clear what the coalition is doing, just a few things, and repeating them endlessly, that matters. And finally, interesting in Richard's presentation, NGOs consistently at the top of the trust factor. Well, apologies to all the NGOs in the room, but my experience with NGOs and their use of money and their mission clarity and their the way they pay their staff, there's a lot of questions for NGOs. But because they, like the National Health Service treats people regardless of their ability to pay. The United Nations has these wonderful human rights commitments. The Labour Party, may keep failing in my view, but because it's a party that wants to fight unemployment and fight social justice, it has a benefit of the doubt. All these institutions have this huge benefit of the doubt because they're very clear about their moral purpose. And any politician today that wants to survive or flourish needs that clarity of moral purpose as well as that clarity of mission, or you're going into every battle, every market with a huge disadvantage.
Thank you. I meant to say at the beginning, never mind the Prime Minister's speech on Europe tomorrow, if it happens tomorrow, he won't be able to match the alternative version that Robert Shrimsley wrote in last Thursday's FT, which I recommend to you if you haven't seen it. Not only more amusing, but more politically acute, perhaps, than the one we'll get. Who knows? Robert, FT readers, in a sense, are getting their finger jabbed in their chest by some of this data, and people are blaming, in general, something called the business community. They may actually mean bankers and finance when they say that. But is there a sense, do you pick this up at all from the readers, that they've had enough of this sort of sneering, jeering from the public? Or do business people actually tell you privately that they know they have to do something about this?
Oh, no, they've had enough. In fact, I've very rarely come across anybody who hasn't had enough of being jeered at. There's a very limited appetite for it. Excuse me, I am a bit croaky today. Just before I come straight back to that point, the thing that struck me listening to Richard and also fellow panellists is, in a sense, I find myself torn between being an advocate for cynicism, which I think actually has its place in society. I think it's a good thing that people don't entirely trust government and question and important elite figures and question their motives all the time. I think there's something in that. I think we should be questioning people who hold substantial power over our lives. And against that, I'm also aware that the increasing level of shrillness, particularly in the media, as we do this. I do think that media has a part to blame in the way that we distrust. I think there's nothing wrong with being untrusting about leaders, but it's the way we do it and the way we question motives, and somehow, and frequently, very boneheaded ways. I remember seeing the day after the coalition was formed, as an aside, I thought when Tom was talking about the two parties with no history of cooperation coming together, I thought, and three if you count the Lib Dems, that the day after the coalition was formed, and there was a debate on Newsnight or something like this, and one of the journalists said, well, Nick Clegg thinks this and David Cameron thinks that. We've got a split already. No, you haven't got a split. What you've got is a coalition. You've got two parties who don't agree with each other, trying to find common purpose. And you see this across the media in its coverage of politics and coverage of business, that there is a very shrill take on it, when sometimes you can be just as cynical and questioning while being a bit more cool-headed and using facts. And I thought Tim's point about the level of time we devote to the political argument ahead of legislation and the amount of time we devote to the effects of that legislation is one very well made. To come directly to your point about business, I mean, obviously, one of the things from this survey is that business is not homogenous, single unit. I think a tech company might take great pleasure in this. And it's interesting, I think, that the extent to which people trust companies who deliver things to them that they actually want. So why do we trust Apple? Apple has many things about it that we ought to be deeply sceptical of, but we trust it because it makes really nice products that lots of us use, and they do more or less what we expect them to do, or more. So, and I think that's a lesson particularly for the financial community, which you were specifically asking about, which is the extent to which they do what it is we ask them to do. I think there's no question that people in financial services, in banking, have borne the brunt of the scorn of recent years. I think there's a question as to whether they understand how rightly they've borne the brunt of the scorn. I mean, I remember seeing, I think it was the not desperately lamented Bob Diamond, giving evidence at a select committee about a year before he fell, where he said something along the lines of, the time for remorse is over. And this was a widely held view among the leaders of the financial services. Look, we took our hits. Everyone's told us how bad we are, but look, come on now, let's get back to business, let's get back to bonuses. And I think there is a sense among the wider community that this is a group that haven't learnt the lessons. And they're right, they haven't in large part learnt the lessons. The difficulty is these lessons don't want to be learnt by the leaders of a lot of financial service companies. And you sense also among them, certainly among the people I talk to, that actually there's no percentage in being contrite or doing lots of things that we might advise them to do, because they're going to be hated anyway. How worth it is it to me to take less money, to act in a particular way? The public are going to distrust me regardless. Leaders are going to question our motives. Regulators are going to be at our throats. We may as well get on with business as usual and just try and be as good as we can, because in the end, if we make money for our organisations, that's going to be the real test. So I do sense there a lack of awareness on this. And I do think the other point that Rich Edelman made that I wanted to pick up on was when we talk about engagement with wider communities, which I think is a hugely crucial thing for all businesses and indeed all media outlets. We at the FT sometimes struggle with having to deal with people who comment disobligingly and inappropriately on our articles and say things like, this was a shoddy piece of work. It's really not very nice. And have to understand that they may have a point. You have to engage with them properly, understand what it is they didn't like about it. Was it just that they take a different political opinion, or that we actually got something wrong? And I think you sense all around business at the moment this buzzword of social media and community and engagement, and everybody's talking about it, and very few people are doing it well. I noted that there was the recent shambles when Starbucks decided to have a Twitter campaign, almost awfully timed around the whole tax furore, in which they said, tweet what you love about Starbucks, and they were going to stream it live. I can't remember what the event was. And of course, what everyone loved about Starbucks was how little tax it paid, and what a miserable institution it was, and how bad so people have got the idea they need to engage in social media, need to engage in community, and very few people are doing it well. In terms of the financial services, and just to finish on this point, I think what it does point up is the huge opportunity for organisations that can suggest they're different, that can suggest there is a reason to trust them better. You certainly see it in some of the marketing in Britain. You can see around some of the smaller financial institutions, Nationwide, Building Society, organisations like that. We're different. We're not the same as all these other global giants, vampire squids and such like. And so there is an opportunity for those people who can manage to differentiate themselves, but they will have to differentiate themselves as much at a retail level as they do at an investment bank level.
Thank you. Well, you've been very well served by a panel so far. It might be time for...
Should we call it quits?
The audience, get up while you're ahead. No, we've got half an hour till the finishing line. And I'm looking for some questions, comments, reactions. I've got one in the middle, and there's a microphone that can come to you there. Thank you. And if you wouldn't mind saying who you are and where you're from, that helps.
Hi, Is it on?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Will from Press Gazette. My question is to Tim and Robert. I'm wondering what you think of the lack of trust in the media and what you can do to address that.
Thank you.
Well, I was going to wear a badge saying "Trust me." Well, I mean, actually, one of the great ironies about the lack of trust in the media, which are of course absolutely right, and I mean, we came out just about worst in this survey in Britain, at least. I'm just about resigning myself to the fact I'm never going to be played by Robert Redford in a movie. You know, we're not the heroes of society in Britain. What I know he's too old, isn't he? One of the things I'm always struck by, however, is how everybody says they don't trust, they don't believe what they read, particularly in the printed press, they don't believe what we read, and actually they believe every word of it. It's absolutely staggering. And even those of us who are in the media believe every word of it. I can think of odd occasions when I've read things in sort of the Guardian Media Diary or Private Eye or whatever, things that are just so staggeringly, obviously untrue. So-and-so I work with is doing this, and you immediately say, forget, I can't believe he's doing this, because you read it in press. And somehow there is this disconnect in people's minds that even though they know they shouldn't believe or know they don't want to believe, they actually do. How can the media address some of those issues? Well, by being a little bit more careful to attempt to tell the truth, to attempt to engage in practice, to stop engaging in practices which are obviously entirely reprehensible, and by serving the readers with a diet of information that is actually useful to them. So, as I was saying, you know, instead of engaging in all the, you know, fight around a policy, actually look at what this policy will mean, what will it do, how has it been implemented, go back and check on it. Now, obviously, different media organisations have different audiences, and they have to serve them in different ways. But the answer fundamentally is to try a bit harder to offer a balanced view of what is going on in whatever it is you're writing about, and not always attempting to appeal to the basest instinct of your readers.
It'd be interesting I don't know if Richard has the information to hand, but it'd be interesting, of course, to distinguish between different media groups. You know, I should imagine brands, be nice to Robert, you know, brands like the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal and the BBC are seen as incredibly different within your categories than perhaps some of the more tabloid newspapers. So, you know, I think one of the things would be interesting would actually to see, you know, the media is often unfairly lumped together. One of the things I think that has improved an awful lot in recent times is, you know, and I would say this, wouldn't I, but you know, is the advent of new media. And I think the media is more accountable than it has ever been before. And previously, you know, people could write stuff in a newspaper about me or you, and we might be able to write a letter that the newspaper might publish in 3 or 4 days' time, perhaps in full, perhaps edited, and by which time the story had moved on. If something is written about any of us now, most of us through Twitter or blogs or even online can fight back immediately. If a commentator writes rubbish in their column, you know, they are immediately fisked. There is such diversity now and so much accountability for the media, and you know, this is just a general problem of transparency. Because politicians, you know, we see their expenses, because businesses are much more open to international scrutiny, because the media are subject to this scrutiny, we in a sense are more aware of their weaknesses and their faults, which drives part of the problem we are discussing today of distrust. But actually in all those mechanisms is equally the discipline for them to get better. And so I'm optimistic. You know, we're at an early stage of an incredibly interesting accountability revolution. And at these early stages of this accountability revolution, we're seeing all the worst aspects of all sorts of professions. But it'll be interesting to know where we go in 5 years' time when people like Starbucks really have understood how this works and how they start, therefore, completely to represent themselves, how politicians completely represent themselves. And, you know, and that's why the longitudinal aspect of the Edelman survey is just so interesting, because we will be able to see how this progresses.
Thank you. Any thoughts on media? You love journalists, don't you?
No, I mean, so over the last 5 years or so, we've had a succession of great institutions made up of individuals who behaved extremely badly. We've seen it in Parliament, in the House of Commons, and the House of Lords. We've seen it more recently in some of the great newspaper groups. We've even seen it in the BBC. And we've seen it in the police, and I think we're going to hear a lot more stories about that over the course of the next few months. The challenge is, what do those people do about it? And Sarah said something which I think is very important. We sometimes talk about institutions as if they are bodies that exist somewhere, but they're not. They are made up of individuals, of people, and it's trying to reinfect those bodies with personal responsibility, which I think is the key thing. So it is journalists, editors apologizing for what has happened. It is demonstrating that they have a new set of ethics. By the way, the answer is not, and I don't think this is a very controversial thing to say, is not to legislate the press into obliging them to behave better. It won't work. This has to come from within.
I do think the point now, I mean, Sarah's obviously right when she talks about individuals, but yet on the other hand, what happens in organisations, even though they are made up of individuals, is this groupthink kicks in which people don't understand that they're doing anything wrong. One of the problems about the expenses scandal, and it's worth pointing out that in many cases, by the letter of the rules, people weren't doing anything wrong, is that MPs all believed amongst themselves that they were hard done by and that they were not doing anything wrong. In the hacking scandal, one of the things that's striking, I know lots of journalists who've worked on places like The Sun, News of the World, and in some sense, I feel sorry for them, because if you spent 10 years coming up through a culture of these newsrooms, and what you did was you hack into people's phone or you called a private investigator, at some point, any individual radar that says this is not how I do things just goes, because this is how everybody you know does something. And the point is, actually, even though at some level people will have understood it was wrong, if this is what you do, if this is the norm of your society, you stop realizing there's anything wrong in it.
But that's precisely why I want to make a distinction as well between accountability and responsibility. Because accountability would say, accountability allows for the argument that people in those contexts make, and we've all heard them, where they say, well, if everybody's cheating on the exam, should I be the only one who's punished? Well, that's accountability, right? So it's scapegoating, right? Or it's that if I can find one person that I can punish for this and hold that person to account. Whereas responsibility would be precisely that internal voice that we're actually, heaven forbid that we should teach people ethics. Heaven forbid that we should actually remind young people, actually young people have a better sense of ethics than many of the older people, but that actually we say as a society that this is something that matters to us, and that you do have to take individual responsibility for your individual choices, that frankly groupthink isn't good enough. Now I agree with you, I'm not trying to be naive. I agree with you that we are social beings, and that is something that starts to happen, but it's also something that we can resist. Casuistry is nothing new, right? I mean, these kinds of elaborate moral justifications so that people can continue to believe in their own innocence, and yet, as you say, on some level they know that it's wrong, and it's that level that we have to keep returning to. I'm not saying that.
I don't think. I think there comes a point when people stop knowing it's wrong, and what they understand is, if I don't do this, I will be sacked, I will lose my job, I will cease to get on. And so I think even though morally what you say is an irresistible argument, actually I look at these organisations, I look at the people there, and I know that for everyone who refuses to call a private investigator or hack a phone, there'll be another 10 people coming in through the door who are quite prepared to do this, and therefore it's only through shocks to the system like the one that we've had that the reprehensible behaviour will change, same as MP scandal, same as other institutions. It's only through external shocks that this kind of behaviour gets changed.
But you see, I also think that the basic principles on which business is license to operate. And license to operate is a legal framework. And in fact, it is, you're supposed to stay within the boundaries of the playing field. And that means that you can drive the car right up to the guardrail. As long as you don't hit the guardrail, you're doing fine. And I think in the moment, that's just not a proper way to do business. I think you have to, move a little bit towards center of the lane. I think you also have to tell people where you're going to go, and then be radically transparent on the achievement of those goals. And again, when Bob Diamond delivered that rather bold speech about banking, and banking is central to capitalism and all this, and I actually think he believes that. And yet it didn't get down into the bowels of the organization because the way in which the bankers are evaluated is simply metrics and, did you sell X number of bonds or whatever it is? Don't tell us how you did it, just do it. Just make money. And that's just not sufficient anymore. I think business has to aim for a license to lead. And being a leader actually means that you are, in a certain way, good for the shareholders, but good for the stakeholders. That it has to be, business is a positive force in society. And I believe that. I believe business is, by far, the best hope, not government. Sorry, Lord. I think government should set the boundaries and let business get on with it. But business then has to lead as opposed to just wait for the law to determine.
Thank you. Alison, a question.
Yeah, just to really sort of a comment rather than a question to follow up on that point about business being self-aware. You would have thought, in a way to the point of pretty much everybody on this panel, that the banking community, especially in London, would have learned something from the column inches that have been written about them, the Bob Diamond incident, and yet only in the last 10 days has Goldman Sachs decided that the timing of issuing its bonuses to minimize the tax liability of those receiving those bonuses would be advantageous in trying to issue the bonuses at a certain point in the tax year so that the recipients pay the least. That strikes me as an incredibly unaware behavior in a sector that is under intense scrutiny and flies in the face of everything we're talking about how do you build trust. It's incredibly just oblivious. So I just wonder how you have companies the size of Goldman Sachs with a reputation of a Goldman Sachs that does these things in the climate of scrutiny where we're all quite concerned about behaviors like that, about tax avoidance for staff getting bonuses.
Thank you. More comments? Yeah, two over here.
Thanks. Will McDonald from Aviva, the insurance and pensions company. It seems to me there's change at the moment seems to come through exposure of a scandal and then sort of reform. And at the moment, there's a lot of people who are doing the exposure. There's new groups like 38 Degrees and UK Uncut and so on, who are driving the agenda. But there aren't very many people who are driving the solutions. We're not coming out the other side. And I guess the biggest example are MPs who've just singularly failed to come up with any new scheme that is acceptable to them and the public. And so I just asked the panel, who's driving the new world as we're ripping up the old one?
Who's in charge of the clattering train? Who's driving the new world? Anyone know?
Well, I guess this is sort of what I'm saying, and it's funny because I thought that I was I thought I was a token on the panel. I didn't realize I was the token liberal. But that actually I'm feeling I feel rather conservative about some of this. In that my sense is that we're not tearing up the old world. We're going back. We need to rediscover an older world. That actually what we're tearing up is the new world. That what's happened in the last 20 years has been, or 30 or 40 years, has been deeply, deeply destructive in all kinds of ways. And that was partly why I was reading FDR. That actually there are things that our grandparents and their parents worked out that we would do well to return to. And I sometimes think, I have these arguments with people about social media where they say, it's such a game changer, everything's different. We communicate in a completely different way, and it's changing interpersonal relationships, and it's changing our cognitive models. And, I'm not a cognitive scientist, and maybe it is, and some people are saying that it is, but it seems to me that we're still using words that are written down to communicate with each other. Okay, it's on a screen instead of a piece of paper. Who gives a damn? We're still people who are interacting in the way that we have, and I actually think it's partly this the sense that we're facing this brave new world, and we think, oh my God, everything's different. Well, it is and it isn't, and I think that to a certain extent, we don't have to completely start all over again. We can go back and say there's actually the wisdom of the ages has worked some stuff out, and we don't have to reinvent the wheel every generation. And some of these old senses of how people ought to work in relationship to their community. I mean, to go back to a world in which So I'll give one example, and I'll stop. It's anecdotal, but to me it's so representative. When my mother was growing up in the 1950s, she grew up in an affluent household. My grandfather was a lawyer. And on her street, in a suburb of Chicago, literally on her street, was also the banker, and her English teacher, her high school English teacher, lived down the street. And the local banker lived down the street. And all of those professions roughly earned about the same amount, and they could all roughly live in the same place. Needless to say, English teachers can no longer afford to live in those neighborhoods, and bankers live in mansions and have private jets. And so it's that stratification. Somebody quoted the other day that in 1970, CEOs in America earned 40 times the average worker's salary, and in 2010, they earned 243 times the average worker's salary. Well, that's what needs to change, it seems to me.
Tim wanted to come in.
Just on a specific thing that Will raises about MPs and how they haven't sort of reformed themselves or sorted themselves out. Well, they certainly haven't fully, but I suppose one big observation I would make is in response to the expenses crisis, we have this thing called IPSA, which is this incredibly expensive way. I don't know whether Tom would agree with his colleagues down the corridor, but it's an incredibly expensive system whereby MPs spend a huge proportion of their time, or their office members spend a huge proportion of their time, filling in enormous amounts of forms, explaining how and detailing what they've spent taxpayers' money on. Now, the cost of this system, just sheer cost of implementing monitoring MPs, is infinitely more expensive than the abuses. It's also the time that politicians are spending on this is much greater than, do we really want our MPs spending all their time doing this? And in terms of my general answer, my worry about the response to a number of the crises we're having, whether it's the press, MPs, or banks, is that we are going into a form of minute regulation that is going to be worse than the problem in the first place. Andy Haldane, the former, still think Bank of England regulator, said something very wise about regulation recently, and he said, if you throw a frisbee, the dog just goes and gets the frisbee. Whereas, a regulator, if they come and think about how you catch the frisbee problem, they will understand exactly the aerodynamics, the physics, everything. They will detail exactly how the frisbee flies across the soil and how speed that it goes at. They'll have a huge mathematical model for how the frisbee travels through space. But at the end of it, they won't catch the frisbee. And we kind of need, I think, forms of competition's incredibly important. It's one of the best guarantees rather than regulation. The consumer's interests are protected. But we need forms of intervention, inspection, random audits. We need to find different ways of solving this problem than going down the road of minute regulation, which is where I fear the press will probably Leveson won't be implemented, which I think is good. But I fear on financial regulation and certainly MPs' expenses, we are making the wrong response to the problem. And sorry, Stefan, but if you look at how the public are looking at the stuff that is coming out for IPSA, it's actually only worsening the problem because they are just all the detail of how MPs spend their money on postage stamps or cups of tea or people are still not liking it, and you're not solving the problem by putting a spotlight on things that don't matter.
I actually don't agree with that. I think that actually, although it may be financially more expensive to have IPSA, I think it's actually, in societal terms, less expensive to have people believe that MPs aren't stealing money from them. They don't deserve to have.
The trouble is, Robert, they still think that MPs are misusing their money.
And they will always, but they will come to understand that if this carries on over a period of time, and I'm not sure, as you were implying, your very first points, that people are paying that much attention to IPSA. What they are paying attention to is MPs' efforts to denude its power. I was going to say, just going back, how does one attempt to instill a better process in all of our institutions? And I think the answer is the creation of circuit breakers within these institutions, the insertion of people who do not think in the same way. If you look at, for example, to the CEO point, the remuneration committees for major companies are essentially staffed full of other CEOs, other people earning roughly the same amounts of money, who all think this amount of money is an entirely reasonable amount to earn. There's not enough people in there from a different walk of life saying, hang on, that seems astronomical to me. And I think similarly amid MPs, be it with IPSA or something else, amid journalists, you need people in organisations that say, hang on a minute, that's not how I think we should be doing things. People who've got a bit of clout and a bit of voice and who can actually just say, and sometimes they will be former journalists, often they won't. You see the arrival of increasingly powerful readers' editors in some organisations. Just people whose job is to say, hang on a minute, that doesn't quite seem right to me. And I think it's someone in-house challenging the assumptions that everybody just automatically reinforces.
Now, Miha wanted and there was a question over here, and so let's take a few. Yeah.
Yes. Mihir Bose. I wonder if the panel could tell me, what we haven't heard is when we have a major change, economic change of the type we've had, there's always a philosophical change. FDR, you said, increased the state. Well, we had the increase of the World War, Second World War, was the highest increase of the state. It was government-controlled. One war lasted till Mrs. Thatcher came, and one would have expected that this crisis, which has made Scottish bankers worse than Scottish goalkeepers, who were always the worst, would have meant a rolling back of capitalism. But none of you have mentioned that. Is that because capitalism is not being questioned at all? Is that the only change? Politicians have lost their nerve. There's nobody who wants a fundamental change, can't believe in it, and therefore it's only a question of regulation and not a philosophical process?
Thank you. I'm going to hamper some together because the gentleman's been waiting a long time over there, and then Miranda. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Matthew Parr. I work for Lord Browne and Madingley. I was struck by Sarah's comment when she said that our political leaders have no skin in the game. They're not incentivized to do well and not punished when they do badly. But it seems that the solution for that is incentives and rewards. But incentives and rewards are dirty words in politics. You know, it seems that we don't like how politicians are performing, but we also don't like the solutions because we don't trust incentives and rewards in politics. So how do we break that kind of downward spiral of trust?
And Miranda.
Hello, yes, Miranda Green. I'm editor of The Day, which is a media organisation that works with teenagers in secondary schools. And I just wanted to comment, actually, on this idea about delivery and do your job. Because I think what Robert said about the Apple Corporation was really, really key for both the worlds of media and politics, both of which I've worked in on both sides. Because I really do think there's something very fundamental about this idea that if you actually deliver what we expect of you, we may retain this healthy scepticism that the panel have all quite rightly applauded, but we won't tip over into cynicism and distrust. And I think when it comes to the media, I mean, I was speaking to a large group of secondary school children last week about politics in the media, and they felt lax on both sides, one of which, from the media, they felt that they got an overburdening of information, but no explanation. And that was confusing, off-putting, and not helpful. So I think we should try and offer what's actually what the real appetite is beneath the sort of superficial appetite for tittle-tattle. And that's extremely important, it seems to me, particularly for the younger generation. But also on politics, coming back to what Tim was saying about delivery and implementation, I think this is absolutely fundamental. The question that I got again and again from these young people was, but why don't they do what they say they're going to do? And I went into some terrible sort of set of excuses about how people set up delivery units in number 10 and then they meet with the Whitehall mandarins and all the rest of it. It just isn't good enough. And I think this is absolutely key to gain the trust of something like the Apple Corporation. Both the media and politics just have to deliver and have to do their job, essentially. That's what people want. When you vote, you sort of delegate responsibility for a set of tasks. Perform those tasks, please.
So, where's the big idea? Where's the big intellectual shift? Why isn't there one? How do we actually reward people, and how do we get trust back in leaders? And is the answer something to do with delivery, doing what you say you're going to do?
Stefan, I actually feel fundamentally that the survey is indicating a growing confidence in capitalism. It's just how you do it, that there's not trust in government. People have voted against more government, in other words, in our survey, that the gap, particularly in developing countries, is massive. I can't understate this. It's 40 points in some markets. So it's down to business to do better. It's not down to government to run the world. People have said, government had its chance, government screwed it up. Let us get on with the world, which is going to be capitalism, done well.
Sarah.
Can I also add to that, that it seems to me that at least in modern history, at least in the last century, there is a very strong correlation between capitalism and democracy. We are seeing that they are systems that coincide with some flexibility, with some ability to function. It's by no means ideal, but it seems to be there. And the going back to the FDR example and to World War II, of course, socialism and communism had not yet been discredited. At least in the ways that they have so far been practiced in the world. Given a choice between, Bob Diamond capitalism running amok and Stalin, I'm going to stick with what I got. It's not great, but it's preferable. So I think that part of the problem is actually a distrust in big ideas, because we've seen that my own sense is that we need to move back to a center where we say, okay, it's the free market capitalism that got us into trouble. It was the extremes. It's trying to take these systems to extremes and trusting the system and thinking that if we just let this idea called capitalism without any regulation, without any kind of understanding about human nature and what will happen if you let greed run amok, well, guess what? So actually saying, okay, this seems to be a kind of functional system, and I absolutely agree with Richard. The question is, how can we make it work without just setting it loose to become a monster, which is what we've done so far.
Just one other statistic that I didn't say in my data dump. There is a much higher trust in small business than there is in big business in the developed countries. And it's just the opposite in developing countries. So it's 80 to about 50 in developing in favor of big business. But I do think, Sarah, that it's important that you go back to that statistic about why do people distrust banks? It's because they distrust the soul of the bank. It's performance, but it's actually in the soul about, the culture of bonuses and the whatnot. So that has to change.
And just very briefly, can I also just pick up on the point about incentives and rewards? But I would say that what you left out of your account was precisely that other half of it, which is punishment. The reason why, I have no objection to CEOs making more than the average worker, although I do think that it should be more in the realm of 40 rather than 243 times. But I have a huge objection to things, as I think most people in our culture do these days, to golden handcuffs and golden parachutes. I have a huge objection to the idea that somebody who has totally screwed something up should then get rewarded for having done so. So it's getting that stuff. And so fine, you can get rewarded if you do a good job. That's an incentive. But you cannot get rewarded if you do a bad job. Then I'm a little bit more comfortable. And that's exactly kind of what I mean, too, about fine-tuning the system. Yeah, but again, you can make various kinds of. I would agree. I don't take the position that the MP should be expected to work for absolutely nothing and be grateful for the opportunity. But people make the same argument about academics. By the way, I appreciate Richard giving me the permission to raise my fees. You'll be hearing from my people later. But again, for me, it's about, and that's why I made that point about when my mother was growing up. It's about getting all the professions to get more respect and to have a more level playing field. I think that's what we need to create.
Tim, and then Tom, and I think everyone wants to go. And then Tim.
Just to respond to Mihir's point about why haven't we responded to this crisis of capitalism? Well, for me, it was not a crisis of capitalism. I think, agreeing with part of what Richard said, it was a crisis of corporatism. It was a crisis of very big businesses getting close to very big government. And there are lots of causes, of course, of the financial crisis, but one of them was U.S. government policy, which basically forced, some would say encouraged, but certainly pushed the American financial industry down a line to provide mortgages to people who could not afford to pay them and pay them back. And a lot of the problems that we have had are because of that a massive failure of public policy. And I think why Edelman find this gap between government and the public is the public have noticed the West Coast mainline franchise disaster. We're about to see the Francis report, which is, I think, going to be one of the most damning indictments of the failure of the National Health Service that we've had for a very, very long time. People know from daily experience some of their schools are great, but a lot of them fail and they're imprisoned by them. And so I don't think that there is an appetite for government to solve this problem when government is consuming more as a percentage of our national income in nearly every Western country than it ever has.
Tom.
I think there is a great philosophical debate going on at the moment, but it's not a binary debate between capitalism and socialism or even communism on the other side. It's a much more pragmatic one. But over the course of the last 15 years, in Europe and in America and in this country, there's been a huge debate about the role of the state, about how much money we should borrow. Within Europe, there was a straitjacket of a single currency without individual current countries taking responsibility for how they subsequently managed their affairs. In Britain, we've had a huge experiment in does throwing money at problems solve them? The answer is that it doesn't. And this government, although it's trying to cut the deficit, it isn't even beginning to scratch at the surface of the debt mountain that has been created. I think these are deeply philosophical issues that require solutions, and the solution is either cutting spending or increasing growth, or a combination of both. And the parts of the world that are growing today are very different from what's happening here in Europe, where we have an aging population, we have unrealistically low retirement ages, unaffordable pensions, and so on and so forth, which really are a crisis with a long shadow which is going to affect us all.
Robert. Okay, just a couple of disparate thoughts. I think, unlike Sarah, I don't wish for the days when I could live next door to my English teacher. That doesn't sound like a quite...
but he did such a good job with it.
Yeah.
Well,
but I do think... But I do think that one thing that we could hark back to, and which we haven't touched on in this crisis, we've all talked about this as crises, rained down upon us by big business, big banks, government. Actually, individuals had a part to play. People did not need to rack up debts that they had no possibility of paying back. I remember writing a story once about a very sad story about a chap who had ended up killing himself because he could not meet the debts from his 27 different credit and store cards. He had racked up debts in a year of something like £50,000, and he earned £22,000 a year. And it was obviously a tragic story. On the other hand, at what point do we hold the individual responsible and say, you racked up debts more than you earned? No wonder you had you faced some of the troubles. Some of the people who took out mortgages, they had no possibility of repaying. They bought into a dream that they could not meet themselves. And some of it's our fault, but some of it's also their fault. And I think one of the adjustments that we're seeing now is people looking back at debt and not thinking of it as a purely good thing, in the way that our parents encouraged us actually not to be in debt and to be careful about it. So I think there's an individual aspect that we have to take on board. I think on the issue of incentives and payments and remuneration, just to hark back at that, I think one of the issues that we face is that we seem to reward almost all CEOs with astronomical sums, when very few of them are quite as transformative and extraordinary as their salary suggests. I don't think any Apple shareholder would have begrudged the salary that Steve Jobs got. Many of the CEOs that we report on every day in the Financial Times, they go, they're replaced by somebody else, business goes on. Very few of them are quite so remarkable as their salary suggests. And I think that's also where remuneration comes in, is distinguishing, the wood for the trees. Exactly.
We're just about out of time. I don't know if there was a question that someone simply
so
had
Stefan,
to... Yes,
the third thing I was we've lionised FDR throughout this process, and for very good reason. It is worth pointing out, FDR was one of the most duplicitous, shifty, untrustworthy
Yes,
politicians in his dealings with anybody else. And there is quite an extraordinary gap between the people that we actually look up to and trust in public life and the way they actually behave in private.
It was Machiavellian as hell.
I think there's one last question right at the back of the room, and let's hear it from the back of the room. Fairness. Fair distribution of microphones. Yes, please.
Thank you. Lord Strathclyde, very interesting what you said about philosophical debate happening about the size of government. I think that perhaps the interesting thing about that philosophical debate is that it's not happening in public. There isn't coverage in the newspapers every day about actually what should the future of government spending be.
Yes, well, maybe you're right. Maybe it is a very political debate. It is certainly happening at the heart of politics and at Westminster. I think some of that is reflected in newspapers, particularly the ones that have more comment and more analysis about what is going on. Miranda was talking about getting people to understand some of the issues. It's not just about reporting news. It is also analysis and commentary on why we do one thing one way or another way. And you're also right, all these debates should be done with public consent. The public need to be involved. They need to be part of the process. They need to understand it. And although it was very funny hearing Tim earlier on talk about the survey of giving people the choices of completely spurious stories that they remembered, it's sort of rather shocking as well. And we should be very concerned that people imagine things are going on which aren't. And we should try and reground and get reality back in so that people understand that the decisions and the choices that they make on an everyday basis will have an impact on them, on their communities, and on their long-term lives.
Now, this is a very go-ahead, informal company, but today the last word does go to the boss, please.
I hope that all of you go back and talk to your chief executives and suggest to them that, in fact, the monopoly of the microphone is over, and that, in fact, the better way to play this is, in fact, to give up control and aim for credibility. And I ask you as sort of missionaries for this, to do this because, in fact, they'll be much better off if they share and have a team approach as opposed to a solo monopoly kind of view of truth teller, because they're not trusted, and they're not going to get trust back in the short run, and they're going to have to enlist and listen and adapt their policies and have a different approach. So that would be the final word.
Thank you. Bang on time. For those of you who are off to Davos, mind how you go. It's very slippery, I gather. But I'm sure before you go, you would like to thank our marvellous panel for their contribution this morning. Thank you. Thank you. Well done. Very easy.